You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Hello, and thanks for joining The American Revolution. This week, episode 370, Vermont joins the Union. When we last looked in on Vermont way back in episode 177, the people of Vermont had declared themselves a free and independent republic. Vermont had never been an independent colony. Various other colonies claimed all or part of it, but the primary fight was between New Hampshire and New York, with some smaller claims from Massachusetts and earlier from Connecticut. But the real conflict arose when both New York and New Hampshire sold conflicting land grants in the region, resulting in fights between people who claimed the same land based on their separate land grants. During the colonial era, the Privy Council in London ruled that the region belonged to New York. The colonial leadership in New York took that to mean that all the land grants that had been made by New Hampshire were null and void, and that those holding claims from New Hampshire were simply trespassers. London officials later clarified that while New York had sovereign control over the territory, the land claims made by private parties had to somehow take into account the private property claims based on these New Hampshire grants that had already been made. New York's so-called accommodation of this was to allow New Hampshire claim holders to pay for their land again in New York. The landholders were in no mood to pay for their land a second time and opted to resist New York's efforts to impose its land claim scheme. These men eventually formed the Green Mountain Boys, which was a vigilante militia that essentially harassed people who were trying to enforce New York grants, as well as law enforcement officers sent out to impose New York's land rules. Now, that was the state of things when the Revolutionary War began. The New Hampshire faction in the region, the Green Mountain Boys, became active supporters of the Patriot cause. Their early action in seizing Fort Ticonderoga, just over the river in New York under Ethan Allen, and eventually forming a Continental Regiment under Colonel Seth Warner. By contrast, many of the New Yorkers backed the Loyalists and ended up fleeing to Canada. In 1777, the people in the region decided that they would not be part of either New York or New Hampshire. Instead, they declared their own independence and formed the state of Vermont, using the French name for the Green Mountains that made up much of the region. The problem was that New York was not going to go along with this. While many New Yorkers had been Loyalists, there were also a great many Patriot New Yorkers who did not want to see the eastern part of their state break away, and many of these New York Patriots still had land claims in that area as well. While Vermont declared itself to be free and independent, the Continental Congress refused to recognize them as such. Representatives from Vermont, which called itself New Connecticut at the beginning, came to Congress in Philadelphia in the summer of 1777, seeking recognition and representation. They used the same arguments outlined in the Declaration of Independence for removing and replacing New York's control over them. The New York delegation in Congress threatened to abandon the Congress and the war effort if the Continental Congress recognized Vermont's claims. So, for the time being at least, Congress refused to recognize an independent Vermont. In 1778, New York Governor George Clinton attempted to reassert control over Vermont, offering to confirm the private land titles if settlers acknowledged New York's authority there. Vermont settlers, however, had felt so cheated by previous efforts to settle their land claims in New York that they refused any consideration of the offer. In 1779, New York insisted that Congress adopted a resolution that no new state could be formed out of the land of an existing state without that state's consent. This law later made its way into the new U.S. Constitution. Now, a lot of states generally took New York's side in this position. Many of them were also concerned about having some of their own state land taken away from them. Also, some states viewed the whole Vermont scheme as an effort by New England to get another state delegation and have more power in Congress. So the people in Vermont, which had declared itself an independent republic, found themselves on the outs with Congress. Their claims could not be recognized unless New York agreed to them. With New York threatening its existence, and with Congress unwilling to support them, the Vermont legislature responded by passing a law formalizing the Vermont militia, complete with a provision to draft soldiers. The stated purpose of the militia was to defend against possible British attacks from Canada, but the effect of the new law reopened the act of violence between Vermont and New York. Any draftee who refused to serve would be subject to a fine or prison time. The state most commonly enforced this by seizing one cow from any militiaman who refused militia service. Many of the men in Vermont, having their property seized, recognized New York's authority and refused to participate in a militia run by the so-called Vermont Republic. Many of them were members of a militia, but it was a militia overseen by New York. Officials seized several dozen cattle from these pro-New York farmers. The men, under the authority of their New York militia, took up arms and marched north to take back their cows by force. This became known as the Great Cow War. To support the pro-New York militia, Governor Clinton called out more militia from around Albany. Clinton, however, could not commit a very large force to this action. Remember, this was in the middle of the Revolutionary War, when New York was focused on Indian and Loyalist incursions from Canada. When the New York militia entered Vermont, Ethan Allen marched his Vermont militia to the region, where his larger force captured the New Yorkers. Because the Yorker militia surrendered without a fight, they were treated rather leniently. Those who were from New York were sent home. Those who lived in the territory claimed by Vermont eventually were given the opportunity to swear loyalty to Vermont, but if they refused this, they were expelled from the state. New York Governor Clinton complained to Congress about these actions, but Congress was fighting its own war with the British. It showed no interest in intervening in this local squabble. Vermont's actions effectively blunted any pro-New York activity in the state, but Vermont continued to rile up its neighbors. One particular sticking point, which impacted not only New York but also Massachusetts and New Hampshire, was that Vermont began to annex a bunch of towns that were on the Vermont border, where the residents asked to join the Republic of Vermont. What would have been even more concerning, but was not really publicly known at the time, was that Vermont officials began negotiation with British officials in Canada to form an alliance against the United States. In 1779 and 1780, British officials were actively looking for ways to divide the enemy. This was around the same time they were negotiating to turn General Benedict Arnold. Vermont was an obvious opportunity for them. These people wanted to be independent. The Continental Congress refused to recognize their claims, siding with their enemy, New York. Vermont found itself surrounded by hostile neighbors, and at some point, Vermont officials feared that these neighbors would turn on New York and crush its claims to independence. Lord Germain wrote to Frederick Haldimand, who had succeeded Guy Carleton as governor of Quebec and as the top military commander there. He also wrote to General Clinton, the North American military commander at the time. Beyond the promise of protection, Germain suggested that these officials offer the Vermont leadership some bribes to accept an offer for Vermont to become its own British colony, complete with the protection of the British Army. Virginia Loyalist Colonel Beverly Robinson was working closely with Major John Andre to turn Benedict Arnold at the time. Under General Clinton's authority in New York, Robinson initiated contact with Ethan Allen and made the British proposal. The Robinson proposal came with the implication that the king would be willing to appoint Allen as the royal governor of Vermont. Allen did not reject the offer out of hand. He recognized Vermont's precarious position, surrounded by hostile states that refused to recognize the Vermont Republic. Even if Vermont had to return to colonial status, a good argument could be made that rule under British authority would be better than rule by New York's authority. Allen later claimed that he just played along, thinking that the British proposal could be used to pressure the Continental Congress into recognizing the Vermont Republic, but Allen really did nothing at the time. He didn't even respond to the proposal, and he certainly didn't turn it over to Vermont authorities. Vermont continued to press its case with the Continental Congress, but the Congress kept delaying making any sort of decision. The president of Vermont, Thomas Chittenden, got frustrated with the Continental Congress, saying it had no authority to judge whether or not Vermont Republic was valid. That was already a thing. Vermont Republic existed. Vermont would never accept being merged back into New York, and Congress had to give up the idea that it was going to debate this issue and make a decision for all the people in Vermont. Vermont was only seeking its rightful place with representation in the Continental Congress. If that was not forthcoming, Vermont reserved the right to negotiate with the British to assure its continued independence from New York. Around this same time, the fall of 1780, Chittenden wrote to General Haldimand offering a truce and discussing an exchange of prisoners. Seeing an opening, Haldimand appointed Justice Sherwood, a loyalist who had lived in Vermont before the war and was serving as an officer in the Queen's Royal Rangers, to become a negotiator with the leaders of the Vermont Republic. Sherwood traveled to Vermont publicly to discuss the truce and prisoner exchange, but while he was there, Sherwood had private discussions with Ethan Allen. According to Sherwood's report to Haldimand later, Allen was open to the idea as long as Vermont remained a separate province with its own military command. Allen also insisted that the negotiations be kept secret and that the negotiations would likely end if Congress recognized the Vermont Republic and admitted it into the Union. Now, this was a particularly dangerous time for such discussions, since in the midst of them, Benedict Arnold's plot with the British was exposed, and concern over possible traitors became a prominent concern for the Continental leadership. Sherwood quickly made his departure from Vermont. Allen reported the meetings to the Vermont legislature, but this only raised suspicions about him. Allen at this point angrily resigned his military commission on the spot and stormed out of the meeting. After that, Allen's brother, Ira Allen, and Joseph Fay were appointed to continue any negotiations with the British. With the threat of throwing in with the British as leverage, Chittenden wrote to the three governors who had land claims over Vermont at this point. Chittenden suggested that keeping an independent Vermont on their side was better than forcing Vermont into an alliance with the British. Massachusetts agreed not to make any claims on Vermont territory if Congress took up consideration of Vermont's application to join the Confederation. New Hampshire didn't really give a definitive answer, but it appeared that it would be willing to support Vermont's claims, but only if Vermont ceded any claims to the annexed territories that had joined the Republic on the east bank of the Connecticut River. New York remained the biggest opponent. Governor Clinton showed Vermont's proposal to the New York legislature and essentially said that this was an insult to New York. The state Senate, however, understood the concern that Vermont might unite with Canada. It voted to send commissioners to Vermont to at least discuss the problem. The Senate, however, dropped this idea over negotiations after Governor Clinton threatened to dissolve the legislature if it did not drop it. In early 1781, Robinson sent a second letter to Ethan Allen. Shortly after receiving it, Allen had a discussion with Seth Warner, who expressed the concern that secret negotiations with the enemy was arguably treason. At that point, Allen turned over both the first and second letter to the Vermont legislature, noting that he had not responded to either of them. The legislature sent them to the Continental Congress. This could have blown up into a whole big thing, but Congress was really too busy with other things to give it any consideration, and the whole thing got tabled. With no action by Congress on recognition, Vermont negotiators met with the British at Fort Illinois in the spring of 1781. At that meeting, the Vermont delegation refused to put anything in writing. Ira Allen told Sherwood that while some of Vermont's leaders were open to the possibility of joining with the British, the people of Vermont were not. Without popular support, there was no way this could work. Allen said that if British incursions into Vermont stopped, they might be able to begin to find a way to sway public opinion in favor of this idea. Sherwood's report to Haldimand after the fact stated that he thought the Vermont delegation was not serious about an alliance. They were really just bargaining for time, and that they probably hoped to use the British offer as leverage to get the recognition they wanted from the Continental Congress. Now, the two sides met several more times over the coming months, with the British threatening to restart raids into the state unless some progress was made, but nothing really went anywhere. Sherwood was right that Vermont saw these negotiations as leverage with Congress. In August of 1781, Congress once again took up consideration of Vermont's application and agreed to allow Vermont's entry if they gave up their claims on the territories that they had annexed from New Hampshire. That fall, an army under General Barry St. Leger moved down to Ticonderoga with the expectation that the Vermont Assembly would vote on the alliance and would welcome the British Army as liberators. The British, who were supposed to treat anyone from Vermont as an ally, ended up getting into a firefight with some Vermont militia, killing one and taking 5 others prisoner. St. Leger wrote a public letter of apology to the people of Vermont. Inadvertently, this letter revealed elements of the very secret and very unpopular deal that Vermont and Britain were negotiating with one another. Feeling that it was in the driver's seat, Vermont rejected Congress's condition that it give up its annexed territories, but it did agree to continue negotiations over its borders. The moment seemed to pass, though. The public voted out the politicians who were considering the British alliance. News of the British loss at Yorktown seemed to sour others on the idea of continuing negotiations with Britain. In 1782, the pro-New York faction in southern Vermont sent a series of petitions to both New York and the Continental Congress, expressing their concerns about the Republic's negotiations with the British and the fact that they wanted to remain Americans. At the same time, New York offered to guarantee all land claims in Vermont without any additional payments or fees if the territory would just agree to accept New York's authority over the land. Governor Clinton continued to add pressure by encouraging Yorkers in Vermont to continue their acts of resistance. He even appointed New York judges with jurisdiction over cases that arose in Vermont. Once again, Allen took an army of Vermont militia to the area that was the center of pro-New York activity in the state. They seized property and arrested and banished several leaders of the pro-New York faction. Allen once again wrote to Haldeman that he planned to do everything in his power to return Vermont to a British province. Congress reiterated its willingness to recognize Vermont only if it gave up on the annexed territories. When the war finally came to an end, efforts to resolve the issue also seemed to wane. The threats from Canada had ended, and New York did not seem to just want to press its claims as hard as it had in the past. Vermont also had no war debts and actually ran a surplus from all the Loyalist property it had seized, so they didn't seem in any hurry to join the Confederation and take on the war debt for the entire country. If they were going to join, they were going to set their own terms. Several Canadian leaders, including the new Lieutenant Governor of Upper Canada, John Graves Simcoe, tried to use trade agreements to pressure Vermont into returning to British control. The easiest way to get goods to market in Vermont was to send them upriver to Quebec. Britain's trade restrictions made that uneconomical, but that could change if Vermont became a British province. Nothing came of that, though, and Simcoe's plan was not adopted by the British. Instead, the British realized that trade restrictions only kept them more divided. So, in 1787, Lord Dorchester in Quebec created a free trade zone between Vermont and Quebec on most goods. The Allen brothers, Ethan, Ira, and Levi, all seemed to warm up to the idea of making Vermont into a British province. Levi secured a contract to provide the British Navy with masts made from Vermont timber. Ira worked on plans to dig a canal from Lake Champlain to the St. Lawrence River to facilitate trade between the two entities. Ethan was still writing to Lord Dorchester as late as 1788, asking for British arms so that Vermont could defend itself if the new United States decided to attack Vermont. For the longest time, Vermont's position was that it would only consider being a British province if Congress denied entry to the U.S. But by 1789, Levi was writing to British officials that he actually preferred the idea of being a province even to that of U.S. statehood. He was also encouraging the Church of England to send a bishop to Vermont to encourage more Anglican converts. By 1790, though, the U.S. Congress was ready to get this matter settled once and for all. It had finally gotten Rhode Island to join the Union and had gotten other states to cede land for western states, meaning that the Vermont issue was ripe for being resolved. A big incentive for the many northern states was that Kentucky was probably going to seek admission soon, so Vermont would provide another northern state for balance. Soon after his election, President Washington made clear his wishes that Vermont be admitted as a state. Probably more importantly, Alexander Hamilton, who was a New Yorker, also became a leading advocate for the admission of Vermont. In the summer of 1789, New York Governor Clinton finally authorized the legislature to appoint commissioners to at least begin talking about the possibility of ceding Vermont and allowing it to become its own state. By this time, as I said, Vermont had its own concerns about joining the Union. Part of it was war debt. There were also concerns that if they did join the Union, New York citizens with land claims in Vermont could bring those claims in federal court and possibly win. Vermont would also probably lose its free trade agreements that it had in place with Quebec at the moment. After considerable discussions with New York, though, Vermonters agreed to pay $30,000 to cover any possible land claims that people had based on New York grants of land in Vermont. It also agreed to take on a share of U.S. war debt. Vermont also finally worked out its border disputes, conceding the annexed lands that were in New York, New Hampshire, and Massachusetts. Officials held a statewide convention that met in Bennington in January 1791 to discuss their concerns over joining the Union. While delegates did voice some concerns on the issues I just discussed, the consensus for joining the U.S. was overwhelming. After a relatively short meeting, the delegates voted 105 to 4 to ratify the U.S. Constitution and join the Union. President Washington received the news and forwarded it to Congress with the recommendation that Congress admit Vermont. Since New York had already signed on to the agreement, there was little opposition. The main argument in Congress was over how many representatives Vermont would get. They finally settled on 2. Because all the objections with the neighboring states were settled, Congress passed the resolution relatively quickly, and Washington signed it on February 18, 1791. The resolution set Vermont's admission for the date of March 4th. With that date, Vermont became the 14th state. Next week, federal officials lay out their plans for a new capital on the banks of the Potomac River. Hey, thanks for joining the American Revolution Podcast After Show, part of the Airwave Media Network. Thanks to my Patreon supporters in the Alexander Hamilton Club, George Davis, Michael Mulhern, and Mitchell Anderson. Thanks to Robert Morris Circle supporters, Richard McCabe, and 10 Crucial Days. Go to 10crucialdays.org to learn more about these 10 days between Washington's Crossing and the Battle of Princeton. At that site, you can also learn about tours and other events in the Washington's Crossing area. Thanks also to Patreon supporters at the standard bearer level, Patrick Love and Theodore Speedy. Supporting this podcast at the $10 level or higher gets you a magnet each month with a different flag from the Revolutionary War. I really appreciate everyone who helps to support this podcast, either through an ongoing subscription on Patreon or a one-time gift via PayPal or Venmo. I also want to give one quick reminder as we approach Black Friday and all of you start thinking about Christmas spending. Using my book links to start your shopping on Amazon will give this podcast a small commission on whatever you buy. You don't have to buy the book that is linked. You just have to use the link to get to the Amazon's website and then buy whatever you're going to buy anyway. The cost to you will be the same, but your purchase will help support this podcast. So it's a great way to support the podcast without spending any money that you weren't going to spend anyway. This week we covered Vermont's entry into the Union. The issue that really struck me was how much the Vermont leadership was willing to consider returning to the status of a British province if it meant getting away from New York. Even after admission to the United States, several of the leaders, especially Levi Allen, seemed to prefer returning to Britain as it would benefit the Vermont economy. His brother, Ira Allen, also seemed to prefer British control. Ira spent much of the 1790s focusing on building that canal that would connect Vermont to Quebec. Of course, as the Union grew stronger and seemed more permanent, these positions grew much more politically unacceptable, which resulted in Vermont leaders backing away from them over time and trying to downplay those positions when histories of the era were written. The idea of secession, though, did not go away entirely. Vermont remained tied commercially to Quebec and Britain. When the War of 1812 began, it cut off most trade between New England and the rest of the world, and there was a movement in all of the New England states, including Vermont, to consider secession from the U.S. so that they could restore their commercial trade. As we know, Vermont was the first of a long line of states to join an expanding union. Admission of new states became a regular part of America's 19th century. In the 100-year period beginning with Vermont, the U.S. admitted 31 new states to the Union. Growth and territorial expansion became part of the American ethos, a pattern that only finally ended in the early 20th century. Since then, over the last 100 years or so, the U.S. has admitted only 2 new states, Alaska and Hawaii. and those two were admitted long before most of us were born. Now, one issue that I only mentioned briefly here, and did not seem to be a big deal at the time, was the concern over sectional advantage. Southerners were concerned about the admission of new northern states because it would give the North more power in Congress. Northerners felt similar concerns about the admission of new southern states. Now, these concerns were not a big deal in the admission of Vermont, but these sectional concerns did grow much stronger over the next few decades as sectional interests seemed to factionalize over issues such as tariff and slavery, which were very big deals in Congress. My book recommendation this week is Moses Robinson and the Founding of Vermont by Robert Mello. The Vermont Historical Society published this book in 2014, and it covers all the events that I discussed in this week's episode in greater detail. Now, the question in your mind may be, who is Moses Robinson, since I never even mentioned him in the main episode? Robinson was president of Vermont during the final year of the fight for statehood. Thomas Chittenden, who I did mention, was president in the years leading up to Vermont's admission. Chittenden got into trouble in 1789 after giving a land grant to Ethan Allen, which many in the state deemed to be corrupt. The result was that Chittenden lost the next annual election, even though he was the highest vote getter and won twice as many votes as his nearest competitor, Robinson. He did not break 50%. So the election went to the legislature, and they chose Robinson. The following year, voters returned Chittenden to office, where he continued to win re-election until his death in 1797. I didn't discuss the election because I had a lot of other things to discuss in this episode, and because it really didn't impact Vermont statehood. Although Chittenden was skeptical of Vermont's admission, he realized that the voters wanted it. Chittenden won election in October 1790, before Vermont actually became a state, and Chittenden chaired the Bennington Commission, where delegates voted overwhelmingly to request admission to the U.S. Robinson was a state judge before he won his 1 year as president. He was appointed as the first U.S. senator after Vermont's admission to the U.S. But this book specifically mentions Robinson in the title because it does credit Robinson with pushing forward the agenda to get Vermont admitted to the Union. So if you want to read more, get the book Moses Robinson and the Founding of Vermont by Robert Mello, and you can use the link on my blog or website to get there. My online recommendation is an old publication with a rather boring title called Collections of the Vermont Historical Society. The link to this particular volume includes more than 300 pages of records on Quebec Governor Frederick Haldimand's efforts to get Vermont to accept becoming a British province. It's a very detailed primary source on this topic, so if you're interested in getting into the actual documents related to this whole cabal between Quebec and Vermont, this is a really good source. This book was published in 1870, so easily in the public domain. You can read or download the book on archive.org, and as always, I've included direct links on my blog and website. My question this week comes from Erdem Hebel, who asks, given how Burgoyne, Cornwallis, and Clinton screwed up things, can we say the last 2 to 3 years of the war proved how correct, at least partially? Maybe there was some logic behind his stubbornness not to encircle Washington's army several times. Well, Erdem, General Howe does get justifiable criticism for his failure to capture the Continental Army in New York or New Jersey in late 1776. In my view, this was the best opportunity for the British to end the war militarily. Most experienced generals, like General Howe, did not want to go into battle unless they had overwhelming force and could be assured of victory. They were not great risk-takers, and they wanted to leave very little to chance. Even when the odds were in their favor, they refused to act unless it was a near certainty. Howe believed this was especially true in his New York and New Jersey campaign in 1776. He wanted to give the colonists the impression that the British army was invincible. By projecting an overwhelming force and not giving the rebel army any opportunity for even a small win, he believed the colonists would accept the reality of British power and would sue for peace. His only mistake, and it turned out to be a big one, was assuming that the fighting season was over in December and leaving small outposts on the front lines in places like Trenton and giving the Continentals the opportunity to score that badly needed win. Now, you know correctly that less experienced generals like Burgoyne and Cornwallis were willing to take some calculated risks when they thought their chances of victory were still pretty good. For Burgoyne especially, and he was a gambler by nature, he thought he could advance his career with this risky offensive that would prove the more senior generals around him were too timid to take. He found out at Saratoga why this was a bad idea. Similarly, Cornwallis could have obeyed orders and stayed in South Carolina, but decided to engage in risky offensives to retake North Carolina and Virginia. He, too, failed in his risky and aggressive strategy. I wouldn't let General Howe off by saying he was proven right. I still think General Howe could have very easily cut off the army in Manhattan in late 1776 without any real risk of loss, and he could have ended the war there. Howe's goal in avoiding this tactic was not just that he wanted to avoid losing a battle, he also wanted to avoid winning a particularly bloody battle. The politician in Howe believed that such a massacre of Continentals in a final battle would have created a bitterness in the colonies from which the British Empire never would have recovered. Had he only been thinking as a general who wanted to defeat the enemy, I think he easily could have been far more aggressive without risking any loss. Later in the war, as British forces were being removed from other parts of the empire, and as Americans were benefiting from French and Spanish support, British generals had to take a little more risk. They would not have had an opportunity to use overwhelming force, and being too timid at that point would have resulted in a failure to retake ground that they believed would be needed in any negotiated peace. So we can certainly understand why generals like Cornwallis threw the dice and lost. If you have a question you'd like me to answer, please reach out to me, either via email or on X, Facebook, Quora, or Reddit. Well, that's all for this week. I hope you will join me again next week for another American Revolution podcast.